Hello and welcome to Unity 101 Week 5. I'm here, and I'm Nelson LeKay, and Gavin's here, and he's Gavin.
Hello. So you're Nelson.
Yes,
Who am I?
you're Gavin.
Okay.
Sorry, I was trying to sound really super upbeat in the intro.
That was good.
Did that pass?
Anyone who's ever talked to you would agree that that was quite upbeat.
Alrighty, so,
What are we doing?
well, today we're going to be doing a few new code things. We're going to be getting turrets shooting at the player, depending on certain criteria. We'll work on our turret prefab and get some new scripts in. That'll be lots of fun. But again, there isn't a lot scheduled for today in terms of new code, specifically for another opportunity for people to sort of catch up. These are live classes, and as much as we love the future people, we're really here in a class format for people who want to take advantage of interactive help. So
Yeah. This is something with Unity. Actually, when you get down to it, in as much as the coding, you've got the reference with all of the available methodology. That's probably the wrong word in this situation. But in terms of how you go about doing things in Unity itself, it's getting used to the process and getting used to the way Unity can be like a stroppy teenager.
yeah.
And just say, I'm not cleaning up my room. I'm not deleting that object, and there's nothing you can do about it to make me. It really, it kind of feels like that sometimes. You see sat there going, I've told you to do this. I've shown you how to do this. Why wouldn't you just do it? Cool. But yeah, we are going to give you the chance to die. Hooray.
So I noticed you actually checked off. Did you answer Wolf's questions?
Kind of, sort of, but not yet.
Okay, so do you want me to go over those, or because I noticed you checked them off?
Yeah.
All right.
Still needs help.
Hey, I have an issue with my turrets. They start out facing the other way, just like they're supposed to, but then they only turn 90 degrees when active instead of 180 like they're supposed to. So don't face the player but just turn to the side. Where am I looking, Gav? I got maybe not. All right, so do you want us to jump? So do you want us?
Sorry about that. My thinking on that is it's probably a timing issue. Probably be easiest to jump to Wolf's screen.
Yeah, first actually I'm going to get. Yeah, I'll do that in a sec. I'll get the code up on my screen so I can reference that. Today's lesson brought to you by another Spitfire wallpaper.
I thought I hadn't seen the writing on it before.
Yeah, I think I've actually seen that. I've had that wallpaper up before in other classes, but I just dug through it today because Spitfire is awesome, even though she only has like 2 speaking lines in the entire 2 seasons. But anyway.
Matt, that rather depends on whether you watch the rest of the video and how familiar you are with Unity already. He asked, for anyone else, he asked if we are comfortable with last week's stuff, will we be missing much by going to sleep right now? And the answer is actually not a huge amount. It's not, again, this is like what I was saying earlier, it's not that we're going to be doing new and complex ideas, it's just that we're going to be doing more of the same to get it so that the turret can actually shoot at the player, or at least shoot. And yeah, so just more code, more prefabs, more stuff. Plus we are, picking up the questions that people have been having throughout the week. So it's kind of part recap and part new bits.
Alrighty, so yeah, let's jump over to Wolf's screen. I got the code up on my end, so I'll be able to reference something. Let's jump into Wolf Nightly. Hello.
Hello.
Hey, Wolf.
Hey.
All right, so if you jump back into Unity, I just want to see where they're facing really quickly, kind of which
Okay.
direction maybe. Just as a tip, you can actually click on one of your turrets. Just click on one of them, and then hit F.
F.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oops. This is going to be the right one, is it? Oh.
You can also double click on them in their hierarchy as well. Alrighty, so it looks like it's not.
No, well, there's the player. There's the player.
Actually, no, that's the correct construction of the prefab, right, Gavin? It's just not facing the right way.
Yeah, because see, it face at the beginning. It faces away, just like yours did.
Right. Okay.
Wolf, could you select the actual turret rather than the sub-object?
Have I selected?
No, you currently look in your hierarchy.
Oh.
You've got new rotator selected. No, go back down.
Oh yeah. Okay.
Activation time 2. Active position. Not 1. Well, yeah. I can see the problem. Hands up who can see the problem. Not hands up, but just somebody shout out the answer. It's on the screen at the moment. Florum's there. Anyone else?
I know.
Yeah, you say that.
Is it facing the wrong way to begin with?
Wolf, look at your turret script. Look at the values that you've got on your turret script. And weep.
Read it and weep. That was one of my favorite episodes of season 2.
Not.
I don't know. Is it active time? I don't know.
See, this is no. You see, you have to. What are you trying to? What? Okay, for a start, what parts of that could be relevant? Or the reverse. What
Active
parts aren't
active
relevant?
range is 50%. It's only doing 50% the active range. So
No, the active range
should
is
be
in
100.
is in
No, that's right.
units.
The active range is the range that it can. That's the distance that it is. That's the distance at which it can see the player.
Oh, okay. Right,
But what?
rotation. Okay, something in the rotation, maybe.
Yeah, you were dealing with rotation, so that anything that's on the riser
That's
is not relevant because that's about rising rather than rotating. And you're trying to rotate 180 degrees,
and I'm only doing 100.
rotating 100.
So was
So
that
that's
set wrong?
180.
Is that set wrong here, or is it set wrong in my script somewhere?
Well, a way to check could be jumping into your script and seeing if that's set in code or if that's set in your
Oops.
editor.
That's not my script.
Pick a tab, any tab. It'll be at the top.
Okay, so this should have been 180 right here.
Because you're trying to rotate 180 degrees.
You can't expect me to see the number 8. Come on. It's above and beyond, guys.
Yeah.
It is actually a difficult one to discern between 8 and 0, but still.
Yeah, I kept going through, and everything seemed to look the same, so I think maybe I just couldn't see the difference.
But that does make logical sense, though, at least, right?
Yeah, that's turning 180 instead of...
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I was just entering numbers.
Because 100 degrees is 10 degrees more than a right angle. That's why you thought it was only 10. It does bring up another interesting thing.
Oh, yeah, you're right.
Did anybody try setting up their turrets in groups and then rotating the groups? Because Ben did. Now at that point you would need to go in and change your inactive and active angles. I think I had a pair that was set up, and I then used them again somewhere else and then rotated the pair.
Did it not work because I was I didn't unpause it?
Group's not a word. It's just group and plain English Jables.
Yeah, I think what you're going to have to, Wolf, I think you're going to have to hit revert on your prefab. Or on your script, sorry.
The easiest thing, no, don't. The easiest thing is just going to be to type it in type it in.
It's right here.
And you're going to have to do that for each one of your turrets, of course. The ones that you've already instantiated.
No.
Actually, is anything going to disappear? Just try hitting revert.
Okay, is that...
No, well, actually, it is there. I didn't know it's there. It's at the top of the inspector, though. Select, revert, and apply. Have you talked about those yet?
Yeah, I think we did.
Well, we must have done.
Oh yeah, revert. Yeah. So I should do that?
Yeah, see what happens. Okay, no, he's going to have to reset his script. So just to verify, though, if you reset this...
I don't think he... have you built in here? Yes. Yeah, you're going to need to reset your script.
I think the problem was I had this plane and paused.
Yeah, if that will bite you. It really will. Bites me every time I use it.
Alright, I guess I don't have that many.
You can select, as Gubicon pointed out, the prefab to make the changes. But again...
wouldn't that mess up the position?
Yes, and no. It's like we were saying before, it's picky about which things you can revert, which things you can reset. And there is a sort of underlying sense to it in that things like if you change a texture on something when it's running, it often works. And then, you hit stop, it will actually stay with the new texture. And it's just very pernickety about what you can change when it's running, what you can change when it isn't. But yeah, basically just go through and change that on all the ones that need it changing, really.
Yeah, there's really not that many. It's kind of being a baby.
Yeah, welcome to life in code. It's kind of...
Well, let's just verify if you change that and you hit play, does it work? And then from there we'll...
Oh, yeah, that's right.
Yeah, we'll move up. We'll leave you to do fixing.
The boring stuff.
Yeah, off screen.
All right, that's...
You can actually, Nelson, do you want to talk about auto properties while he's doing that?
Oh, there we go, it works.
It looks right. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sweet. Let's jump back into JSON, which happens to be me. All right, auto properties. It looks like some people are slightly curious about what the get and set does on members of C#. Okay, so can anybody tell me what the difference between...
Anyone who hasn't been in the C# course.
Yeah, anybody who hasn't been in the C# course, tell me what the difference is between these two members. Line 7 and line 8. Anyone? Right. The first is a field, the second is a property. In C#3, they introduced the concept of an automatic property. Now, I can show what a non-automatic property would be like. It would look something like this, where you would have a property along with a backing field, and you would specify the getter and the setter of the property in terms of the backing field. However, because typically the code was written like this so often, in C#3 they introduced the concept of an automatic property, where we can simply specify that we want this property to have a get and a set, but we don't want to specify the backing field. The backing field would be specified for us automatically. So there's a lot of debate when Microsoft introduced this. I mean, earlier, I love programming history and stuff. Back in the days of C++ and in Java too, because Java doesn't have properties, it was always considered best practices to never expose fields publicly. Exposing fields publicly is a bad idea because fields represent data, and data is an implementation detail. So in languages like C++ and Java, which don't have properties, they did what are called accessor methods, where you would have a method like, public int get pony correct, return pony correct, something like that. That would be the getter, and then you would have a public void set, and so on.
And you'll still find these. In fact, in Unity as well, you'll find there's quite a few get and set accessor methods as opposed to just properties. None spring to mind at the moment because my brain is...
But the point is that this is how you did it in traditional languages. Microsoft introduced the property syntax, which was similar to this, except for more concise. And then Microsoft introduced the automatic property syntax. So now that the automatic property syntax and the field syntax is so similar, a lot of people have been going, why don't we just use public fields instead of public properties? Well, there's actually a lot of good, compelling reasons why you should use properties over fields, and I'm not going to get into them, into great depth.
Oh, go on, get into them. It's entertaining. How many people in this class, in fact, show of hands in the webinar system, please. How many people have not taken part in the C# 101 and 102 classes?
Yeah, because we are slightly going over a little bit of a recap.
This is one of the trickier things with this, which is that we're trying to do Unity stuff, but we're also trying to sort of lead people through C# as well.
Right. So, I mean, if you guys want to really in-depth talk about this, definitely go to the C# stuff. Just as an overview, first of all, using an automatic property is always preferable to using a field, just because that is the standard, that is the convention, that is what you should do. But there are a lot of reasons why you should do it. It has to do with, first of all, with properties. Even automatic properties, we can specify them as read-only by giving them a private set. Obviously, this isn't a read-only field, which is a different concept, but still blah, blah, blah. Another reason you have stuff like reflection and compatibility, binary compatibility, and a lot of other concerns that you should be very not aware of, because you don't need to be aware of them, because you should just be using public automatic properties instead of fields.
The key thing is security. Basically, there is, can you, have you got anything, can you show what it looks like, its own, behind the scenes?
You mean like that?
I suppose, yeah, I mean, that's about it, except the name is like, it's something like backing underscore.
Yeah, it's going to be like backing.
I can't remember what it is.
It's going to be an unspeakable
It basically makes up, this is shorthand, the get set thing. It's just shorthand in order to save writing all this out, because as anyone who's doing the C++ course will have found, that's something you still have to do. You have to write your own getters and setters in C++, because auto properties, well, they don't exist. But it's all about safety. Pony correct could be your PIN for your credit card. It could be, this is something that you don't want necessarily anyone else to be able to change, but it needs to be available. So properties are a way of basically defining, sort of building a wall around them and putting a gatekeeper on that says, all right, you're allowed to look, but you can't touch. Yeah, my analogies are really not happening tonight.
But anyway, the point is automatic properties are preferable to public fields. That being said, we do use public fields when working in Unity, as you see right here. We use these out of necessity. And we use them because Unity needs to have access to public fields in order for them to show up in the inspector. And the more and more I think about it, that actually does make sense from an implementation standpoint. Originally, I was kind of like, oh, that's stupid. But then I was like, well, if I were to actually implement this code, what would I do? And then the truth is, I would probably force the same constraint.
It also allows for, I'm sure, have I done it yet, or are we going to do it today? I'm sure at least once we've got a point where we are taking the value from a public property here and using it in a field somewhere else. Oh, reverse that. Wow.
Yeah, but anyway, so I hope that answers your question. There's no real one reason why you should do it. There is the overarching general programming practices that you should always follow, but there are also some interesting reasons you should do it from not only just a design/convention standpoint, but also from you could potentially break binary compatibility if you don't do this. You could introduce bugs into your code if you don't do this. Other libraries won't understand your code if you do this. So I hope that yeah, I don't want to spend
everyone.
I don't really want to spend too much time on this. Okay, so when you have time for it, my player CS script is screwy resharpers flagging the I enumerator and destroy ship co. You said it was in your player?
Can I just say flagging is remarkably non-specific?
Yeah, I was about to say, what is the issue? Red letters. Huh. Do you mind if we jump over to your screen? Oh, that's okay. As long as you can still type. Yeah, you're missing a using statement.
It's trying to tell you. Oh, it's not anymore. System collections, you've got multiple choices on your...
See, that's the the I enumerator is a...
Well, if you hit Alt-Enter,
Yeah,
it's telling you to. No, you'll need to be...
Yeah, now if you hit Alt-Enter.
And then...
Because it's telling you to hit Alt-Enter. Say, whenever you see that, just hit, say, use resharper command. That's just saying you've never done this before, and it's making sure that it can bind to that shortcut. So just hit OK. And now try again. Try clicking on that, because you can't... Oh, there you go. Now... Oh, you had it for a sec. Go to the bottom.
You know what it is? We've got a lag thing going.
Yep, click on that. And there you go. Now you still have a problem right there. Set active recursively. That's because it's not game object with capital G, it's game object with a lowercase g. Game object with a capital G is the game object class, whereas game object with a lowercase g is the game object property that's inherited.
Yeah, you'll notice that now you've changed that, it's changed colour. The actual word has changed colour from cyan to white.
Yeah.
Wow. See, this is why I have yet to switch up, because the new colour scheming, attractive though it is, really confuses me. Because there's all these different colours. But, yeah, anytime you see anything in that kind of cyan colour, like collider, input,
Wait
game
for
object
seconds.
further up, yeah, wait for seconds, mono behaviour itself, that is an indication that that is a thing in the language. I'll let Nelson say anything more specific.
It guarantees that it specifies that it's a type in the language. A type meaning a class, an interface, an enumeration, a struct, or a delegate. So yeah, and yeah, keep in mind
Static,
though, whenever
static methods are the... You go. Okay.
Keep in mind though that whenever you see that little pop-up saying import this thing, blah blah blah, just either click on it or hit Alt-Enter, and it'll bring it in. Also, for future reference, remember, IEnumerator is in the system.collections namespace, whereas IEnumerator T is in the system collections generic namespace. All right, looks like you have a syntax error. If you double-click on one of those errors, Hover over switch state. What is... Oh, I see it. Look
Yeah.
very closely on line 45. And actually, read the error, actually. Non-abstract... non-abstract and non-extern method must declare a body. Well, why would C# think that you didn't declare a body on this method? Keep in mind that a body is the actual meat of the method. It's what's defined after the curlies. Now, why would C# think that you didn't declare a body? Because you clearly have one right there on lines 46 through 48. But how could C# possibly misinterpret your intent? No, actually, your body's fine. It's actually the error's on line 45.
Something's making it fail to find the body. Essentially, it's failing to connect the signature and the body
Yeah, no,
together.
don't worry about those. That's not actually the problem. Something on that line is telling C# that you don't have a body on this method. So keep on going. Oh. Oh.
In fact, compare it to any other methods that you've got there. Start, update on GUI.
Oh. No. So you have a parameter list. That's fine. You don't need another parameter list. But there's an extraneous symbol. Ah, there you go.
Extraneous.
Whichever.
Well, the one that I said, obviously.
That terminator at the end of your method was telling C# that you didn't have a body. You were actually telling C# that this method does not have a body, and then he was like, okay, well, you don't have a body, then what's all this stuff afterwards?
So hopefully if you hit build now, well, you'll have one fewer errors.
Yeah, and keep in mind that I go through this with like excruciating detail with students just so people don't forget these things, you know what I mean? I'm not trying to be facetious or mean or anything like that.
Yeah, we're not being. If it seems like we're being patronising, it's only because we are. I mean, it's only because it's only because it. Yeah, we both sound like that. We've got that sort of voice, I'm afraid.
It's this stuff has happened to us countless times.
That is the one. For me, that's the one thing about programming. You do keep these sorts of problems. You do them, and then eventually you look at them one day and you don't even think about them anymore. You don't. They're just automatic. Well, it's a language. It's the same as learning any other language.
Sure.
We used to, I studied French for 5 years at school because you have to over here. And we did a trip to France, and it's only when you're actually living in another country, not with no possibility of speaking your own language, you actually start to think in that language.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that's quite a good example to understand it, because rather than thinking, oh, I want to say hello to this person. Now, hello in French is bonjour, and then saying bonjour. You just start thinking in French instead of translating what you want, thinking in English and then translating into French. And it's the same with the programming. It just starts flowing.
Right. So now, are there any more errors within your code?
I don't think there are. Oh, he hasn't built yet.
Alrighty.
Hit F6.
And don't forget to save, by the way. You haven't saved your file. In fact, if you had your file like this and you jump back into Unity, it would give you the exact same error because you haven't saved yet. But if you do like a Control-Shift-B or F6 or whichever... okay, just making sure. Alrighty. Alrighty, so I'm going to jump back. Alrighty, so now what else? Does C# have pointers?
You really don't want to go there.
C# does have pointers. but they only work in the unsafe context. And you should never work in an unsafe context. And because you should never work in the unsafe context, you should never even think it's a possibility to have pointers in C#.
And if any of you out there don't understand a word of what Nelson just said, don't sweat it. Just you don't need to know about it if you don't already know about it.
In the start method of turret CS, the player equals GameObject player line gives me an error when I build. Adding a getComponent.player works though. So what can my problem be? Well, if it
For
works.
a start, is your player object actually called player? No, I think what he means is he can do the get component bit, but not the actual.
But that gets the player. I'm
no,
confused.
what I mean is, I'm guessing that it compiles, but then obviously it's throwing an exception in Unity when it tries to find the player and can't.
Well, actually, this is what's going on. In the original code, we just did GameObject.findPlayer, and he says it compiles if he does .getComponent player, like this. That's because on your player field, if you look at your player field, that's on my line 19 of turret.cs, I have a GameObject player, not a player. I'm assuming that you have a player, not a GameObject player. Keep in mind the difference between a GameObject and a monobehavior. See, player is a monobehavior. As you see, it inherits from monobehavior. Now, if we look at the definition of monobehavior, you'll notice that monobehavior inherits from behavior. If we look at the definition of behavior, you'll notice that behavior inherits from component. Now, that's the important bit. A monobehavior is simply a component. Components are added to game objects. So a game object is what contains all the components that represent that object, as well as a transform.
Well, for example, just as an example, in your get component on line 13 there, change game manager to game object and show them what happens.
Game manager to game object? Oh,
yeah.
Right here?
Type. Yeah.
Well, that's going to be a...
Yeah, that's my point.
Yeah, you'll notice that when you do the .get component, there's a generic type constraint that only allows whatever we specify as this generic argument to be an object that or a class that inherits from component. As if you read the error, it's not that scary, everyone. It says the type GameObject must be convertible to component in order to use it as parameter t in the generic method getComponent. Now we can do game manager because game manager inherits from monobehavior. Monobehavior inherits from behavior. Behavior inherits from component. And finally, component inherits from object, and then object inherits from object. It's actually really interesting to go through the decompilation of Unity. If you don't have ReSharper installed, here's another great feature of ReSharper. It comes with a decompiler, meaning by hitting F12 on monobehavior, I can actually look at the implementation of monobehavior from within Unity. And it provides some really interesting insight.
Do anything to it, hence that little lock icon.
Yeah, it's just a decompilation. It's not actual code that I can look at. You'll also notice stuff like if you do this, notice it says like wrapperless iCall. These with the method impl of being to internal call, that means that this method is actually implemented in C++, and this method is just a wrapper around a method implemented in C++. So if you go digging within the decompilation of Unity, you'll see this a lot. And whenever you see this, know that this method is implemented in C++, and there's no chance of decompiling that bit. Okay, so let's see. So did that answer your question, Ahmed? While he's answering, I do want to point out that yes, I didn't know this for certain, but I'm 99% certain that monobehavior does build in IL spy, or it does have ILSpy built in. I'm pretty sure I saw that mentioned somewhere, and somebody just said that it does the same thing in mono develop. But
yeah, go to declaration. If you have got resharper, the shortcut, I believe, I'm trying to remember whether this is default, but it's F12.
right, if you
Go to declaration
but
and Alt-Shift F12 to go to usages.
right, and but if you don't have resharper installed and you try to go to the definition of something that's already compiled, all you will get, you won't get the implementation of the methods. You'll just get a listing of all the public methods. So it doesn't do decompilation. It just does reflection. Or it goes to the object browser. I can't remember. I haven't worked with a Visual C or Visual C# without Resharper for a while. Well, except for the C# courses, but we don't talk about decompilation.
We don't talk about those here. I managed to, by the way, I've managed to delete about 4 things that I hadn't ticked off already from my list of questions because I forgot that it scrolls the wrong way.
Okay. Do automatic properties show up in Unity then, since they're not public fields? No, they do not. Public properties do not show up in Unity. For some reason, I'm thinking that someone somewhere at some point in some class that I did at some point in time possibly may have said something about having properties.
I'd leave that at being no.
Yeah, not settable through Unity, but being able to be viewable through Unity, but I can't remember if that's even true or if my memory is just...
It is, but in certain circumstances, and when things are running, you can go up and to the top right and switch over to debug listings, and you can get more information.
Okay.
But yeah, I'm hazy on what and when it gives.
Okay, so let's see. Sorry, tonight is just for doubts.
No, we are going to be doing new code tonight.
Yeah, we'll be shooting. Well, we won't be shooting things. We'll have other things shoot at us. Is a game object like an entity in a traditional entity component game model? Yes, indeed. In fact, Unity is a pretty decent implementation of component-based programming for game design. It has a lot of things that kind of irk me about its implementation, but it is very much a traditional component-based architecture, described by things like I think there's an article in Game Programming Gems. There's a variety of articles online. One of the guys who did the Tony Hawk Pro Skater games did a nice little write-up about entity designs. Dungeon Siege 2 did a nice little write-up about entity designs. And that is the architecture that's used by Unity. Also, is there an easy way to find the root object, first parent of a nested game object? I know game objects are transform.parent gets the parent, but is there a function anywhere that can get to the root object without having to make a recursive function? Well, when you say root object, what do you mean? So, for example, if I were to... if let's say we wanted to get the root object of here, turret small, new rotator, new riser. Now, what is the root object of new riser? Now, intuitively, somebody might say, "Ooh, it's a turret small," but there's no difference to Unity between turret small and the actual root, which is segment 1. So are you asking for how to get segment 1, or are you asking for how to get turret small? Because the answer is going to be different in both cases. This is the true root object, as far as Unity is concerned. If you wanted
Although, in actual fact, behind the scenes, there's almost certainly an invisible and utterly untouchable world object that everything's attached to as a child anyway. It's certainly that's the way it's done in a lot of modelling programs as well. There is a world object as far as the program's concerned. It just doesn't tell you about it or let you touch it.
So, Hector, did that... I do need to know what you're expecting. Are you expecting to get segment 1, or are you expecting to get turret small? Because that's going to change my answer to that question. If you want turret small, then you're still going to have to write a recursive function that finds an object with this turret script attached to it. So the method might look like this, for example. So if I jumped into, if I just wrote a new script really fast, blah blah blah, doesn't matter.
Well, that's quite a good pop quiz. If you were to go to your um,
All right. So if let's say that class 1 is attached to,
the turret,
hold on. Wait a sec. Hold on. Yeah, that's the implementation. For people who are curious, the implementation that he ended up writing was something like, you know, get turret or something, and then passing in a game object parent, and then he would say return parent dot get component turret does not equal null, and then a ternary on parent, otherwise a recursive invocation of get turret with parent.transform.parent. Now, of course, one issue with this, can anybody spot an issue with this code? So who can spot an issue with this code? And what I'm doing is, again to recap, pretend that class 1 is attached to one of the children of turret small, and we're wanting to get a turret small. Can anybody tell me why this code could potentially be problematic? Because there is a big problem with this code. Well, not a big problem, but a problem that could cause pain.
Ben, just be calm, do Zen breathing.
Oh, I know I'm missing the first call, but so let's say, public void blah. This would be, var turret equals get turret, and then it would pass in itself. Or sorry, pass in game object. Should it be turret small and not turret? No?
This is just an example.
Problem with this code is there's a possible null reference exception on line 14. The possible null reference exception is that transform.parent is null. What I would do in this case is I would probably ditch the ternary and write out something like this. If parent get component turret does not equal null, then return parent. Otherwise, if parent.transform or parent.transform.parent does not equal null, return parent.transform.parent and then invoke get turret with it. Otherwise, throw a new invalid operation exception saying expecting parent with turret script attached. The problem is, previously the code would just throw a null reference exception, and that null reference exception has absolutely no semantic value and will confuse you in certain circumstances. If you were to write, I were to have written...
It's the equivalent of it saying, something broke.
Yeah. So in this case, what I would do is I would say, okay, if I would detect for the null reference exception, and because there is no appropriate response, and maybe there is an appropriate response, this method could go either way. Maybe this method returns null if it can't find a parent, in which case that's fine. Now you've made code that doesn't throw an exception but returns null. However, I'm assuming that you want to assume that this method will always succeed. And if you assume that this method always succeeds, then throw an exception if it cannot perform its duty with an appropriate message that won't leave you scratching your head for hours.
And this is particularly important in Unity.
Exactly.
because of the difficulties you have had. Somebody asked a question related to that. Somebody did ask, is there a way to actually jump into scripts and debug with Unity, putting in breakpoints and such?
Nope.
Nope.
I believe there is with mono behavior, but I never dealt with mono behavior. Or mono develop.
Develop, yeah.
Okay, but yeah, that's just a side note for people who are working with Unity and want to write scripts like this. Always think about what the potential exceptions could happen during your code. Because if you get a random exception during development, especially think about a designer. If you just handed this off to a designer and he tried to use your script and it was throwing a null reference exception, he would throw his hands in the air and scream at you for hours. But with this message, now he says, expecting parent with turret script attached. You know, that's a language that he can understand. Be like, oh, well, wait a sec. This mono behavior has to be nested underneath the turret. But, okay. Is there a way to actually jump in? Oh, blah, blah, blah. Do we now continue our built levels or backbone that we had? Yes, we continue with that.
I think he was asking either or. Should we go back to the backbone of the U-build? Basically, we'll be doing at least one or two more, or you will be doing at least one or two more levels anyway, as you'll find out later. But yes, you can carry on with your own particular implementations. Partly because that's a good way to realise when you've bitten off more than you can chew. And I say this from the point of view of always doing it, which is you get all these great ideas for, I could do a really cool thing here if I had a turret that suddenly turned into a giraffe and fired boomerangs out of its mouth. And then you get into it and you suddenly realise that actually is you've got to build a giraffe, you've got to teach it how to throw boomerang. You know, there's a lot to do. Oh, sorry, Wolf. Well, you can carry on with that. Hey, that's my idea. Yeah, it sounds awesome, and then you go to code it. Because, as I said before, you can't really avoid coding. You have to tell it what to do. And so if you've gone completely overboard on your level and you've got 8 different individual types of turret that all do utterly different things, you're going to find yourself with a lot more. Well, at the very least, you're going to find yourself having to check a lot more things and make sure that you haven't broken anything by doing something. It's just complicated.
Words. Alrighty.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to go ahead and pause the video. It's time for break. Put in any more questions you guys have that you want us to answer, any more questions from last week, because when we get back, we'll be going over the material for this week, which there isn't a lot of. I wanted to give the opportunity for people to catch up. So, yeah, I'm going to pause it, and we're back. So, let's see. Someone thought the homework would be, the class would be canceled. Who thought the class would be canceled?
I was kind of wondering.
Well,
I think due to everything else having been cancelled this week.
Yeah.
But no, not on that grounds. You can't. Just for no.
Ooh, we got a question, a general programming question. ReSharper also says I can make get turret function static. What does that mean? Well, from time to time, ReSharper will find. Let's find a private method. Actually, you know what? Let's just make a private method. And then let's invoke this private method so ReSharper thinks it's actually used. Notice how ReSharper is telling me that I can make this method static. The reason I can make that method static is because A, it's private, meaning making it static will not affect anything else. Notice if I make it public, this goes away. It's because now I can no longer make it static. It's now a public method, meaning if I were to make it static, it would break call sites. But because it's private, ReSharper says that I can make it static. And the reason ReSharper says I can make it static is because this method does not use any non-static members of this class. Watch if I use manager. or let's just say, I don't know, debug log manager. Notice how I can no longer make it static. That's because it's using a non-static member of this type. If you understand the difference between static and non-static very well, then I would encourage you to make any private method you can static. If you are not very comfortable with the difference between static and instance, then I encourage you to watch the C# 101, C# 102 classes and not worry about it. Because I see a lot of people who follow ReSharper's advice of making private methods static and then get confused as to why they can't access local variables or local fields. And obviously that's due to the fact that local fields are, or local instance fields.
Yeah, part of the problem in this is that obviously until you put anything into the body or the method signature, all methods can potentially be static because you're not doing anything in them and you're not using anything in them. So ReSharper, like you had there before you added anything to it, it will tell you always at the start that you can make this static. And I did get into a bit of a feedback loop for a while with that, in that I bring in the method signature using alt enter enter.
Right.
And then it says you can make this static. And so you go, all right, I'll make it static. And then add the code, and then it can't be static anymore. And so most often static methods will be helper methods. They will be methods that just maths methods and things like that, where it's doing something that isn't particular to the instantiation you've got, but is a general piece of functionality.
Stuff and things.
Yeah, stuff and things.
So methods should only be static when only manipulating properties that belong to the class that don't reach beyond the scope of the class. No, methods should be static if they only access other static members, or they don't access members at all. See, this method...
If you had in your player class, you had a list of players, which is not something you really want to do. You'd want a factory class, but it's something that is a more static way of programming. What are you doing?
Notice how with this method, nothing I'm doing is accessing an instance field of this object. I'm doing some local variables, I'm invoking a static method, I'm instantiating an object, I'm invoking another static method. I'm not doing anything that accesses the local instance members of this type. Therefore, I can make it static. However, the moment that I access something that is an instance member of this class, which could be manager, it could be the update method, that's another instance member, onTrigger enter is another instance member, destroy player is another instance member, destroy shipco is another instance member. The second I try to access any one of these, I'll get an error if this is static. But again, I don't want to spend too much time about that, simply because we covered staticness in the past. Okay, so people, who's going to be following along, because we're about to write some new code. There's not a whole lot of stuff that we're going to be writing, but it should be fun, I suppose.
Yes, this is actually, you need surprisingly little code, surprising in some ways, to actually do what we're going to do today, which is we're going to get things firing from our turrets.
Yep. And
they are only going to do that when the player comes within range. But anyway, over to you.
Mm-hmm. All right. The first thing that we're going to do is we're going to revisit our turret small prefab. What we need is we need a game object that'll allow us to know where the projectile should be fired from. So we're going to be adding a nice little thing to our
Yeah, well, basically, what we've got here is a turret, and obviously you can see there the, or you could, the, I always manage to say that when you switch away. You can see there you can see where the barrel is, and actually, can you go into like a side view of that and probably wireframe it so that you can actually see through to the relevant bit. Now, we've got all these objects which are centered at 0, 0, 0 to themselves as far as they're concerned. We don't really know where that barrel is in relation to the object itself. It's possible, one way to go about it would be to actually, talk with your modeler and come to an arrangement whereby that you know that the barrel's going to be in a certain place, but that's a backwards way of going about things, because that would create an incredible amount of extra stuff to do for anything but the simplest of games. Well, you need to know. Well, what would you need to know to make this look right? Because it's not necessarily the most obvious thing in the world. But in order to fire what is essentially, and are you going to, Nelson, are you sticking with the names that I gave them?
Depends on the names. Yes. Well,
yeah.
Should I? I like the word.
Well, I don't know.
I like another one.
I like the word. Yeah, I do as well, but it kind of seemed relevant. Okay. Basically, we're doing this like it's firing cannonballs. We're going to be launching spheres out of this thing. Yes, you need an emission point. That's a very good way of putting it. Wolf Knightley, no. You need an emission point. You need to know where it's coming from, but also you need to know, well, something else as well. And I'm going to see if anyone can get that. So you need to know where we're going to fire things from. Rymac's in there. You need to know the direction that you're firing things at. You need to know, because otherwise you could just be firing straight up from the turret, or you could be firing straight forward, but that's going to look very, very strange because, well, we're expecting, we all know, our brains know what direction to expect things to move in given situations. As we're kind of programmed that way. And basically, the long and the short of it is, there's nothing there to tell us, or there's nothing there that you can then tell Unity about to say, look, this is where to launch the ball from. So the approach we're taking with this is actually adding on another chunk to the prefab, which is going to be a barrel segment that overlays the barrel that's there at the moment. And to that, we are going to use that as the actual firing component of the weapon. That in and of itself will know where its own transform and rotation are, and thus we won't have to calculate these things in code, because otherwise you would have to do lots of horrible calculations, some of which wouldn't even be possible. You just simply wouldn't be able to.
Well, you'd have to guess, and then
you'd have to guess. It would just be tweak, and
it would just be a lot of bleh. Okay, so let's go ahead and fix this up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get out of the scene. I'm going to jump into our nice little scratch scene, because I like this scene. And then I'm going to bring over our turret small prefab. I'm going to position it to 0, 0, 0, although that shouldn't matter because we've already done that. Just for the possibility of it mattering, I'm going to set it down to 0, 0, 0. Then I'm going to go to game object. So actually, hold on. I'm going to reset everybody's participate. Hit participate if you're going to follow along. Do not hit ready if you're going to follow along, because I am resetting that.
Good night, bread sausage.
Bread sausage. Oh. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go up to game object. I'm going to say create other, and I'm going to create a cylinder. The cylinder is what I'm going to use to represent the barrel. I'm going to give it a scale of point...
You know what? Can I make a suggestion before you do that? I would actually ditch the turret for now. I'd just work on the cylinder, because then we can show off some things to do with direction and stuff, rather than doing it all with the turret there.
Well, yeah, if I go ahead and nuke the turret for now, I'm going to go ahead and set its position doesn't really matter because we'll be changing that in a second, but I'm going to change its scale to 0.15, 0.15, 0.15, so 0.15 in all directions. Then I'm going to go ahead and, now I could do the rotation here.
But that would be a very bad idea.
But it would be better to figure that out in the context of a turret.
Well, in the context of anything, because remember, this is a separate object. This is not necessarily, currently it's still named cylinder, by the way. And it's a good habit to get into naming your objects as soon as you create them, because it's very, very easy to get into a situation where all of a sudden you've got 18 things called cylinder and a couple of spheres and this, that, and the other.
So I'm going to rename this barrel.
Okay. I find that, particularly when you're dealing with anything that involves movement, any mathematical calculations, to zero everything out and work to identities, which is 0 for position and rotation, and it's not going to make any difference in this case, but would normally be 1 for scale across the board, because that way you know you're kind of you're lowering the number of things that could potentially be wrong until it's set up. Once you've got it set up, you can then go about tweaking it to fit the particular situation you're using it in. The way this is set up, you could add this. You could add this to the player. You could add this to the to anything that you could just leave it hanging in space on its own. Yeah. So I just want to make that point.
Okay, so now that I have a cylinder named barrel with a scale of 0.5, 0.5, 0.5, I'm going to go ahead, bring over our turret, and center that up on 0, 0, 0.
Oh, I see. You're doing that, are you? I meant literally do the whole thing, do the script. You don't need the turret until you've actually finished the cannon itself.
True.
At all.
Well, I wasn't.
So it's just because that's the way I approached it, because then you can fire it and move it and rotate it and.
Well, I wasn't planning on implementing the script until I was planning on creating that dummy script, but not implementing it until we could test it.
Okay, whatever. Yeah.
But all right. So now I'm going to go ahead and just eyeball its position. And at this point, it's very helpful to go into wireframe and to sort of line it up. And I'm going to bring over the rotation tool, bring it up into this angle. And I'll give you guys all the numbers in a second, but I kind of want to show people how I would derive these angles myself. I mean, if you have a different approach.
I had a slightly different approach because I made the model. So I just went, oh, that's at 15 degrees.
So I'm just going to position it like that, and then I'm going to go ahead and move it in, have it protrude a little bit further than that.
That rotation should be 75, I believe.
Yeah. So if I go ahead and give it, actually, I think you may have gotten a different. There we go. So now if I go ahead and go up to texture.
80, not 75. Sorry. Thank you.
So anyway, at this point, it really is just a matter of playing around and getting the right numbers, or if you can derive the math yourself because you've made the models, then doing that. But at this point, I'm feeling pretty good about this particular barrel. So the last bit that I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to apply a nice little texture to it, or a nice little material to it. And if you remember, we do have the metal hex grid already in our textures, because we should have imported that last week when we gave you all the assets that you should have brought in. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new material for this particular aspect of the prefab. So I'm going to jump into Materials, go to Create, go to Material, and I'm going to call this Barrel. Now this one's going to be kind of fun, in that I'm really just going to move in the texture to it. So I'm going to click and drag on the metal hex grid, bring it over to the texture, which I could have done by hitting Select and double-clicking on metal hex grid, whichever way you want to get the texture onto the material. And then I'm going to click and drag this material right onto our barrel. So we get this nice little textured barrel thing.
It's the 3D Buzz tribute barrel. Every time I see hexagons now, it's just anywhere.
The last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go down to scripts. I'm going to say create a new C# script, and I'm going to call the script turret barrel for now. Then I'm going to click and drag turret barrel onto our turret. And to verify that the script was attached, you'll notice it's down here, turret barrel.
Just to clarify, you drag that onto the barrel.
Yes, exactly. I dragged it onto the barrel, not onto the actual turret itself.
If you expand the hierarchy, excuse me, coughing.
Right, and notice I haven't even parented the barrel to the turret yet. We'll talk about that in a moment here. But all I did, however, at this point we've attached so many scripts to things that however you want to attach a script to it, you can. For example, if I removed this component and I click and drag this turret barrel into the hierarchy, I could do that as well. So whichever way that you want to get the script on is fine, as long as you get the script attached to the cylinder that we created. The last step is...
Do you want to nuke the collider on it?
Yeah. One thing that there is a extra capsule collider. We're not going to be worrying about this. This is just going to be extra computation that really doesn't matter. So I'm going to remove the collider entirely.
Yeah, because if you think about it, for a start, we've already got the mesh collider that takes up most of that space because of the barrel underlying it. That's part of the turret riser. But yeah, it is extra calculation. Remember, these calculations are done at least 30 times per second and many, many more times per second in most cases. So any time like that where you think, oh, well, it's just, it's a capsule collider, it's not doing much and it's not in the way, I don't need to. It's always worth thinking about whether you actually need it there. The only reason it was there was because it's there as part of the cylinder prefab. And we don't need it, so just hit the button and remove component for the collider.
The final thing that we're going to do to get this barrel set up is we're going to parent it to the new riser. So our hierarchy should look like this. Alright, so hit 1 more minute if you need more time, hit done if you are done, and
You know and's a conjunction.
you what?
I said you do know and is a conjunction,
Yes.
not a full stop.
Well, fine. Semi.
No.
Actually, that is supposed to be used for collecting or grouping fragments, though, isn't it? So in the English, it really isn't a terminator.
No, it's not. It's a clause separator.
Right.
It does actually perform the same function. It implies that what follows is indirectly related or subservient to what goes before. I assume you're paused because you're waiting.
No, I'm actually not paused because
right.
there's only one person who is still working on this. So I'm actually be sure to hit 1 more minute if you guys are still working on this. Otherwise, we're going to just go on right ahead. Seems like everybody.
Yes, a clause separator. It's some sort of veterinarian tool. We have yet to make note that we haven't actually done anything to our prefab.
Right. So can anybody guess as to what we have so far forgotten to do? Is the barrel in the new riser? Yes. The barrel is parented to the riser. No, we're not going to drag and drop into our project window, because that would create a new prefab. We don't want to create a new prefab. This is an existing prefab that we're editing. And now that we've edited it, by adding a new child component, we can go ahead and select the parent of the prefab and hit the apply button that appears in the inspector. By doing that, the barrel is now a part of the prefab. Okay, so let's jump over to our other scene and look at the code we're actually going to have to write in order to get this barrel to work.
And again, this is part of my, what seems to be, this course has been all about discovering my own paranoia with Unity. If you hop over into the other scene, and just, the next thing I would do is check a turret in the other scene.
I do have one
to make sure that
one turret
that did actually work.
Yep. As you see, it does have our nice little barrel attached to it. So by hitting apply, even though this wasn't a turret or a prefab that was instantiated in a different scene, we still got our game object that we added to our prefab correctly added to our game objects that we instantiated.
Yeah, and Ben, I suppose that, but I was just thinking it wouldn't apply to the other scene. This is the key thing. What we did there is we worked on an instantiation of the turret in the Scratch scene. When we hit apply, it takes any changes that we made there and it applies them to the actual prefab that is being used to create all of the turrets that you put in the scene.
Right, including the ones you've already instantiated.
In the project, rather, not in the scene, in the project. All the ones you've already instantiated, and it propagates through, so that when you go back over to the other, it's looking at the same object. It's looking at the prefab to find out what it needs to put into the scene, but the prefab is now different. Mm-hmm. So, magic. And Pazuzu. See, this is why I don't drag into the scene or game windows. Pazuzu said, "Oh goodness," because it's a polite and civilized environment with no swearing. My Starfield has the metal hex drill material.
Yeah, if you miss, then hit Control Z. So, for example, if I went to materials and clicked on barrel and drug it on my Starfield, now that looks actually kind of terrifying. But I can go ahead and hit Control Z to make that change go away.
That actually looks kind of cool.
Well, it looks a little bit different than what you'd expect to see in space. Space. You haven't played Portal 2 yet, have you, Gavin?
Yes, I have.
You have? Oh.
Yeah. It's one of the very few games that I was actually willing to pay full price for.
Oh. Well, see, I assumed that you wouldn't have paid full price for it, so I was like, oh, you probably haven't played it. Okay, so let's go ahead and actually implement the code for our barrel. And it's going to be very straightforward. I'm going to jump into code, scripts, and turret barrel. Double click on that. Unfortunately, I had Visual Studio already running. Now, because I'm super paranoid, I'm just going to hit Control W, Control comma, Enter. Just to, because sometimes when I have Unity open up a code editor, ReSharper decides not to work. So again, closing the file and reopening it seems to fix it. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to fix the different formatting within my file. So nuke out and extraneous using, make both of these methods public so ReSharper stops complaining about them not being used, remove that annoying comment that appears every time you create a modded behavior, which, I mean, whatever. Still. Okay, so let's go ahead and go about writing out our code. First thing we're going to go ahead and do is add some public fields that we can configure within our inspector. I'm going to create a public game object projectile field, and that's going to allow us to select what we want to be considered our projectile. Then I'm going to go ahead and add a public float attack range. I'm going to set it to 25 for now as the default for the field. Keep in mind that although that is the default for the field, you can still override it within the inspector. And then I'm going to give it another float field for attack delay. Next few things I'm going to do is I'm going to give it a public bool is alive property. It's going to be a public bool property with a public getter and a public setter. Then I'm going to create two private fields. I'm actually going to create, I'm just going to create two private fields, one for game object player, and one for private float attack timer. Now within start, I'm going to say player equals gameObject.find player. Now, if you did not rename your player component to be player instead of player ship, then you'll have to change this to player ship instead of player. Remember, this is finding a game object based off name within the hierarchy. Next, I'm going to set the attack timer to 0. And I'm going to set isAlive to false, because we want our barrel to be considered not alive when it's instantiated.
Yeah, remember, the actual isAlive bit was one of those, oh yes, I suppose I better do that things. In that, well, when you're actually, it exists in the scene from the start. When you hit play, it exists there, and therefore, if it started out being alive and capable of doing things, you would just have all your turrets would be firing all the time from the start. They would be able to fire, which doesn't really make any sense if you're on, say, the start game screen or or nowhere near the turret. So, and these all these fields, the purpose of them will become obviously more apparent once the code is in place. Someone did ask though about in BuzzNet about this railroad show said those attack values, are they from enum statements like in the first video? No. Well, for a start, they're floats. Nelson, do you want to just clarify anything you think needs clarifying about?
Enums only work on integral values. They do not work on floats. And am I pronouncing that word right? Integral?
Integral.
Integral. There we go. Enums only work on integral values. They do not work on floating point values. So even if we were to have used an enum, which I wouldn't use in this case because an enum is not a constant. Well, I mean, they are constant values, but they are not semantically the same thing as constants. It would be impossible for me to represent either of these things in the context of an enum.
The attack range it's a distance. In exactly the same way as the range that we used for waking up the turret. And attack delay is actually an amount of time in this case. But it'll be easier to explain once it's actually there, because you can look at it and go, oh, that's what it does.
Right. So in update, I'm going to go ahead and say if not isAlive, return, because obviously we have nothing to do. Then I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to show everybody an awesome feature of ReSharper.
This is the way I always do my create my methods.
Okay.
Because you do it the opposite way around from me, don't you? Generally.
Well, I mean, it depends on what I'm doing. But can anybody tell me the shortest amount of keystrokes I could make to implement both can fire and fire as empty methods? No.
Fantastic. Ben CG gets a cookie.
That reminds me of the funny story in the IRC that I did like a couple of years ago, but I'll keep that.
Yeah, I think I was there for that. That was hilarious.
Okay. Check this out. ReSharper for the win. Alt page up focuses my mouse cursor on the first error preceding the line that we're on. Alt enter creates the method and opens up a live template. Now that the live template is over with, because I hit enter, I can now hit alt page up again to focus my keyboard cursor on the next error, which is can fire. Now I hit alt enter. ReSharper correctly identifies can fire as a method returning a boolean. I hit enter one more time, and now I'm focused on the body, and I hit Control Shift S. So yes, that's probably the shortest amount of keystrokes you can get to implementing these two methods from ReSharper. If alt page up does nothing for you, you might not have ReSharper installed.
Or you might be at the top of the file. Or alt page up is not actually doing anything to do with creating any of these. It's just moving your mouse cursor to alt page up and alt page down will move your mouse cursor forwards and backwards, an error at a time, through your code.
Mm-hmm.
Well, not necessarily an error either. It could be a warning, like the whole static thing from before.
Sometimes. Whether or not it goes to a warning, it depends on if there are any other errors in your file and a few other settings. I found the behavior can be sometimes slightly unintuitive, but for the most of the time, at the very least, you can count on it jumping to errors, and sometimes it'll jump to warnings. Okay, so what is canFire going to do? canFire is simply going to return vector3.distance player.transform.position smaller or equal to attack range, and attack timer is smaller or equal to 0f. All this is doing is saying if the player is in range and we are and our timer has reached a 0, then we can fire. What is fire going to do?
And this, sorry, before you go on, because I want to point out that this line 34 is a direct alternative way to do the check. Can you bring up the turret CS, please? And slip down to the inactive, rather. It's line 47, update inactive. Yeah, it's doing exactly the same. In fact, it's doing exactly the same calculation. That is a distance check written out, and that is a method that will work in a very similar fashion internally.
Okay.
I just wanted to point that out because there might have been people going, well, why aren't we using distance? And why aren't we using... They do the same thing, it's just two different ways of doing that.
Okay, this is going to be a fun discussion.
Yeah. You might want to actually fully type that because it's gameObject.instantiate.
I was just thinking that, actually.
For explanation, yeah.
Of course, ReSharper's going to squiggly it, but we'll get into that in a second.
Yeah, there's about 4 things happening on that line.
Okay. Actually, you know what I'm going to do? Well, no, we're not at about a time. We're not quite at a time for break, so I'll explain this, and then we'll go on break.
Okay.
And I'll keep the code up for everybody when we go on break so people can copy down and get ready. What this is doing here is this is invoking the gameObject.instantiate method. The gameObject.instantiate method is a static method on the game object, or sorry, it's not even on the game object type, it's actually on the object type. So I could have done object.instantiate if I wanted to. Of course, this is going to conflict with the system.object, but whatever. The point is that instantiate is a method on the game object type. However, the reason why ReSharper is squiglifying this code is because when in C#, you do not have to fully qualify static method invocations of methods that come from the classes that you derive from. Now, you might see, oh, well, that makes sense. But sometimes people get confused. Because if I try to invoke the instantiate method from outside of a mono behavior, I would have to do gameObject.instantiate. But because I'm inside of the context of a mono behavior, and because, again, mono behavior inherits from behavior, and behavior inherits from component, and component inherits from...
the knee bone, I believe.
I used to watch those all the time. Object. Because it ultimately ends up with inheriting from object, we have that static member already available to us in this scope. So this method is not a magical method that just came out of nowhere. It is a static method on the object class that we can use without a qualifier, because we are inheriting from the type that it's a static method of. But what does it do? Well, instantiate, notice how I'm combining it with our gameObject projectile. The interesting thing about public gameObject fields is you can do one of two things with them. you can select a prefab, or you can select a game object in your hierarchy. If you a prefab. Oh, wow. No, wait a sec. That was right. Yeah, you can select a prefab in your project window, or a game object in your hierarchy. If you select a game object in your or a prefab within your project folder, to use it, you have to instantiate it by invoking the instantiate method and passing in the game object to it. This in code creates an instance of your prefab.
It actually, and one thing I do like about this is, and you will be able to see this in a little bit when we actually do it in Unity. It calls it whatever the name of the projectile object is, and then brackets clone. This is a clone of an object. You're not. This is as opposed to going and saying the prefab is a new game object. Do you want to actually put up what it would be if you were doing that as well?
If I was doing
just to if you were actually just creating a new game object. There.
Yeah, I would have to do something like var go equals
comparison.
new game object, and then I would do go.add component, and then I would pass in whatever component I wanted to it. Like, let's say we wanted to pass in player, then I would have to do go.transform and so on. But by doing instantiate, what we do is we get a copy of all of the stuff that was already set on that game object, including all the components that were set on that game object. So it's a very handy little way to reinstantiate a bunch of things that you'll be creating, which is nice because we're going to be creating a lot of projectiles. And furthermore, we're going to want to be able to alter the behavior of those projectiles within the editor. Maybe we wanted to attach a component that gives it particle effects, or we wanted to attach a component that gives it a particular shader, or maybe we wanted to add a new script to our projectile for some sort of reason. We can do all that.
Yeah, it might be a frag grenade that after 5 seconds you could make a grenade that after 5 seconds or when it hits something will then explode and create loads of bits of shrapnel that blow out.
Area of effect spell.
Yeah.
So by doing this, I can do all of this awesome stuff in the Unity editor and not have to worry about configuring that stuff within code. So this is a nice little aspect of when you play with Unity the way Unity wants you to play with it, you do sometimes get some nice little benefits.
Somebody is pointing out the another resharper thing, which is the possible system null reference exception. This is one of those ones that you will find yourself ignoring more often than others.
In fact, I actually changed the inspection options of this to a hint for the possible null reference exceptions, because this being a null reference isn't possible. Now, it is possible the way the code is written. The way ReSharper is statically analyzing this code, all it knows is that we were trying to do an upcast. Okay, notice what instantiate returns. Instantiate returns an object, and we do an upcast to a game object using the as operator, which means that...
What's an upcast?
Actually, we're doing a downcast, sorry.
Well, what's a downcast?
We're doing a downcast, which means that we are going from a less derived type to a more derived type, which means that it can fail. See, from ReSharper's perspective, ReSharper will see that we're returning an object and we're casting it to a game object using the as operator. ReSharper is going to say, well, actually, according to the rules of C# and all the things that I know about this code, instantiate could return anything that inherits from object. It doesn't necessarily have to return a game object. So when you apply the as operator to it, in ReSharper's eyes, we open ourselves up to the possibility of a null reference exception in the case that instantiate does not return a game object. That being said, we can ignore this error because we know logically that we are passing in a game object into instantiate. Therefore, it is going to return a game object. Even though the actual signature indicates it's going to return an object, we know it's going to return a game object. In fact, what I'm going to do, now that I'm thinking about it, I'm going to change this from an as to a cast.
To a direct cast.
And can anybody tell me what the difference is?
I wondered about that.
You what?
I did wonder about that, but as looks nicer.
Well, it does look nicer. But anyway,
that's literally the basis of my decision making on that. I was just like, as I like the as way of doing things.
But I just changed where an exception could be thrown. See, the as would have not thrown an exception. It just would have thrown an exception right here. It would have thrown a null reference exception. And null reference exceptions, like we said before, have really no semantic meaning. By doing this, I am literally telling C#, I don't care what you say. I don't care what you return. You will give me a game object, or you will die doing so. And if it dies doing so,
Yeah,
it'll throw an exception indicating its death.
Yeah, we've separated, we've sort of divided and conquered here, because what we're doing is we're doing the instantiate method and then casting it to a game object, which will then either work or blow up. As opposed to before, where we were instantiating something and then checking to, basically doing a built-in check to make sure that it was a game object. I mean, the reason that we have to cast it to a game object, can anybody think what that is? Yeah, you have got the code on the screen. So, can anybody see why we are actually forced to cast this?
Right, just set its transform. Tizer, check your capitalization. Instantiate does not return an object. Instantiate returns a Unity engine.object, which is not a system.object. Remember, object equals system.object. Unity engine.object is different. So I want people to understand the difference. When you see instantiate returning an object, that is not system.object. That is Unity engine.object, which is not the same type whatsoever. And almost insanely, or insanely in the sense that this could make your head spin, but not insanely in the sense that it isn't required by the specification of the language itself, this object type actually derives from system.object.
We did have a question come in about object pools.
We'll use a pool of reusable objects for projectiles, or just instantiate new ones for every projectile. We're just going to be instantiating new ones. We're not going to be worrying about pooling them. Keep in mind that instantiate is a fairly fast enough method to do what we need to do. We're not going to be pooling our objects. Though typically in pooling objects can be good for projectile type things. We're just not worrying about this at this particular level right now. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and hit reset. Hit ready if you're ready, 1 minute if you need more time. And for people who need more time, I'm going to go ahead and pause the video, and we're going to go on break.
Okay.
And we're back. So, now that we've done our turret barrel, let's go ahead and jump into our turret. And if you're curious as to how I did that, Control-T, type in turret, and hit enter. Otherwise, you could go the slow way, go under Assets, Code, Scripts, and double-click on turret. I'm going to add one line of code to this class. I'm going to jump down to Update Activating. When we become active, I'm going to write this code. I'm going to say get component in children, passing in turret barrel, and I'm going to set is alive to true. The getComponentInChildren method is a very handy method that, not surprisingly, will get a component within the children. It will loop through to an infinite amount of nesting all of the child objects that are parented to this object, and it'll find an object that has a component of this type, and it will return it, or null otherwise.
Is there any way of telling if you had multiples on there, which one, without...
No.
What would it do if you didn't supply a name in your parameters?
You mean...
Say you had a turret that had 4 barrels on it.
Yeah, at that point you'd have to say get components in children. Which actually
of course, yes.
is a better idea.
Do you want to actually talk about all those different... those 4 methods? 6 methods?
Yeah, I'm going to actually do this myself. I'm going to say get...
Yeah, that does make more sense now I'm thinking about it. It was only because I knew that I was only using one.
Right.
I was putting on one, so I did it with one.
So instead of this line 67, I'm going to do line 64 and 65. The difference is that this one is get components with an S. There's an S in there. That is very important, because if I did get component in children, I would get a compiler error. Get components in children, and then pass in my generic parameter. Now you'll notice that there are a few get components methods. We have get component and get component of t. Get component is the non-genericized version of get component of t. You should use the genericized version if we're working in C#. We have get component in children, which finds one component in the children's. We have get components, which finds all of the components with this one game object. And then we have get components in children, which finds all of the components of the children. So this is the appropriate code right here. So is everybody good with this code? Anybody have any questions about this code? I'm going to assume no. So hit one more minute if you're still typing out this code, because it's the last code change we're going to do tonight.
Is it?
Well, we do have one little change, like one tiny little change we have to do, or two tiny little changes, I suppose.
Wow, that's just even less code than I remember there being, and I do remember thinking, wow, that's not a lot of code. Lauren said, I do think that the S in children will haunt. Well, they actually said the S in children's, and that's wrong. And such will haunt people.
Indeed.
Yeah, that goes on. I did have a little soapbox in break about people need to, spell. Basically. But that's just my general worldview. Okay.
All right, the last few things we're going to do is I'm going to go ahead and change this. Instead of -90, I'm simply going to say rotator, transform, local Euler angles, x. There's no difference with the behavior of this code, other than this is a little bit more correct in that it's a little bit, well, it's just nicer.
It's more flexible. It's not relying on that -90 actually being -90.
Yep.
Anymore. It's just basically passing through the value that's there.
And that's actually, I think that's about it for...
Actually, you can delete one of the comments in your update active.
Oh, right. So we're no longer filing. We're no longer filing missiles at the player.
We are going to file missiles.
This
Fantastic. We're going to...
This is our enterprise enterprise game development. We're going to have to file some missiles.
It's Starship Enterprise. Sorry. Oh dear.
I love bureaucracy.
Shame you can't say it.
Bureaucracy?
Anywho.
Okay, so actually this is it for the code. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump back into Unity, see this work. Well, actually, almost see this work, because we're still missing one more thing. And then because we have so little to cover, I'm going to go ahead and do that really quickly now, and then we'll come back and actually talk about our and get everybody to catch up. But because we have just so little to cover and so little code, I'm going to add one more script. I'm going to call this a turret projectile. Now,
I called it a cannonball.
yes.
For anyone who's interested.
Well, you know why I like this name more.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I will sit there for upwards of half an hour trying to work out what name to give things, because I'm afraid you've got a capitalization error on speed. And MMODOS gets bonus brownie points for spotting that it will currently crash. You see, this is why I was going, are we really done with the code? I didn't realise you were just talking about the alterations to existing stuff.
Yeah, unfortunately I forgot about the particularly important bit of this.
The actual thing that we're going to fire.
Okay, so I'm going to have this script implement iGameEntity, and he's going to go ahead and say player destroy player, and then destroy game object. Okay, the final bit of what I'm going to do, and again, I'm just covering this really quickly for the future people because future people are we'll have plenty of time to go over every bit of this in a second. Hopefully, this code is self-evident. I'm not expecting everybody to have it typed out at the moment, but this code should be self-evident.
There's one thing, yeah. Space.self in the translate is something we haven't talked about before.
Well, if you want to go ahead and...
Yeah. This is all what we've been talking quite a bit actually about local and global, and these are just different words referring to that. We're telling the projectile basically to move itself in a particular direction, which is, as far as it's concerned, straight along the y-axis. Space.self means that it's using its own local rotations y-axis. So whatever angle it's rotated to, that will affect the y-axis. If this was either absent or space.world, literally, in fact you can probably show that in a minute in the thing, but they would literally just go straight up out of the top of the barrel, thus killing the operator and making it a very easy game because all the enemies' turrets would blow up.
Yep.
Does anyone not understand about space.self versus space.world from that remarkably concise and erudite description? Well, it's one of those things where, to my mind, it's self-explanatory, but I've been modelling and stuff for years, and you get used to thinking about that sort of thing. Florence says not really. The world space is probably, obviously, it's self-explanatory. Yeah, it's local versus global. So, oh yeah, can you close down your pop-ups? Thank you. World space is literally that. It's what you think of as world space. So X is left and right, Z is forwards and backwards, and Y is up and down. The same applies in self-space, but the object could be pointing in a different direction. So if I'm facing north and I decide to walk east, I end up walking east. Or rather, if I'm facing north and I decide to walk to the right, I end up walking east. However, if I'm facing south and I decide to walk to the right, I end up walking actually west. Now, in this case, right is a reference to my local space. It's my right. Whereas north, east, south, and west, they're global. They are the world space. Did that make it any less unclear?
Yeah, and... yeah.
Well said.
Okay, so let's go ahead and jump back into Unity really quickly and create our prefab for our projectile. So what our projectile is going to be is it's simply going to be a ball. So I'm going to start by going to Game Object, Actually, no. I'm going to start by going into my scratch scene. I'm really liking this scratch scene a lot. I'm going to go ahead and into my turret small and delete it because we're no longer working with that prefab. Then I'm going to go to game object, create other, and I'm going to say sphere. Then I'm going to position it at 0, 0, 0. Then I'm going to give it a scale of 0.5, 0.5, 0.5. Then I'm going to do a few other fun stuff to it. I'm going to leave it with a sphere collider, but then I'm going to go ahead and set is triggered to true.
Note that you don't need to change the radius of the collider. I mean, you could make it 0.5 exactly if you wanted, but there is a reason that it's... I mean, the reason that that comes up slightly bigger than 0.5 is because generally you want collisions to... If things do intersect, it can cause you all sorts of problems from a graphic perspective. Nasty things can happen. So generally, Unity makes all its colliders that are automatically generated just a little bit bigger than the thing that they are actually the collider for. But you don't need to change that in terms of... People might be thinking, oh, well, if we've made the scale of the whole thing half as big, we should change the size of the collider as well. Remember, the transforms affect all the components, because these components that are here in the inspector are literally scripts, just the same as the script that we're adding. It's just that they've got a fancy graphical interface built into them. But we can go into that in more detail another time. That's for later.
I'm gonna center out the 0 to, I'm gonna tell the 0. I'm gonna set the center to 0, 0, 0. Just because notice how they're very small numbers right now.
I was just trying to remember how many digits floating point covers. Is it 8 or 16?
Either way,
because either way, those would actually be 0.
Yeah. They're pretty much. They're pretty much as zeros.
If you notice something in there that's got E and then
negative
an E in a number, either way, it's either going to be absolutely massive or absolutely tiny.
Yeah.
It's either going to be infinitely big or 0. That's the exponential, which if you don't know about mathematics, then go look on Wikipedia.
Yep. I'm going to change this to turret projectile for the name.
And remember, this is the name. This is what we referred to. Did we refer to this? We did.
No.
I'll shut up.
Okay.
No, I can't remember. I think I'm thinking of something else.
Then I'm going to go ahead and add a rigid body to it. So I'm going to go up to Component, Physics, add a rigid body. I'm going to uncheck Gravity, and I'm going to check this one, just so that we'll have control over its transform, and it won't be using gravity.
Check which one?
The option underneath Gravity. Then I'm going to go under Code, Scripts, and I'm going to click and drag the turret projectile onto the turret projectile. So now our turret projectile game object has a turret projectile script attached to it. And I'm going to leave its defaults there. I'm going to leave the speed at 0.5 and its life expectancy at 2. Finally, I'm going to go open up my prefabs folder within the project and click and drag turret projectile into the prefabs. So now we have a prefab of turret projectile. Now there's one more thing I'm going to do. I'm going to delete this out of the hierarchy because we now have a turret projectile prefab that was created from our game object in the hierarchy. I'm going to bring back the turret for now. So I'm going to click and drag the turret small, bring it into the hierarchy. And then I'm going to actually configure its cannon, or its barrel, sorry. I'm going to jump all the way into the barrel in the hierarchy and select it and go into the inspector and go under the turret barrel script. Now if you recall, the turret barrel script is the script that we just previously wrote a few moments ago, and it has a public game object projectile. I want this projectile field to be defaulted to our turret projectile prefab. So I'm going to jump back into Unity. I'm going to click on the projectile field on the turret barrel script. So notice how I have the turret barrel script select. I'll collapse everything else to make this more apparent. So we have the turret barrel script clicked on, and the projectile clicked on. And then I'm going to click on this little button, and I'm going to select turret projectile. Alternatively, if I wanted to clear this out, Actually, notice how I have assets selected. I don't have scene selected, I have assets selected. Alternatively, I could have click and dragged this turret projectile onto our game object right here. And now our turret projectile is set as the prefab for our turret.
But also notice that, in fact, if you unhighlight that particular line, just click off into notice that that whole line now, projectile, turret, projectile, is in bold.
Mm-hmm.
That is an indicator that something has been done and it no longer matches up with its prefab.
Correct. So,
I just wanted to point that out because we hadn't yet. That is helpful once you get used to it.
so the last thing we need to do is hit apply. Now notice how I didn't actually jump all the way to turret small and hit apply. I just hit apply from barrel. That's because this aspect of the prefab is what we're applying. That's the change that we made. I could have gone all the way to turret small and hit apply as well. It would have done the same thing. So now that we have this set, if I jump back into my other scene, my scene 1, and find my turret, small, my new rotator, my new riser, my barrel, notice how its projectile is now set to turret projectile. Although that's the default, we're not constrained to just using this one projectile. We could quite easily make additional turret prefabs that shoot different projectiles. So that's a fun little thing.
Could fire the player ship.
So now if we hit play, we now get our turret shooting at us. And notice how I died.
It's going to be very difficult to see on the video, but you should all be able to see it at your end. It's going to be difficult because they are tiny.
But if I dodge them, I don't die. But then I hit a gate. So that's really it for the code we wanted to add. I do want to go ahead and wrap up this video. Of course, we will be here for any more questions that people have. I mean, is there anything else you...
We will be dealing with getting the player to basically shoot back next week, because it's not just as simple as adding the barrel onto the... In fact, there's a quick pop quiz question. Can anyone tell me why it's not just as simple as adding the barrel onto the player as well? Because that's, something, a logical thing people might think of doing. We've now got this barrel that we can attach to things and shoot. Hector's kind of halfway there. Or not, actually. There's an implementation detail at the moment. Yes, Florum's nailed it. It will kill the player. If you remember, we are dealing with this at the moment in terms of obviously the collision causing the collide fire, but that is hard-coded to kill the player.
Right.
So the player would basically only be able to commit harikiri. So yeah, that's why we're not dealing with that way.
Alrighty. So I think that about wraps it up. So I'm going to go ahead and hit stop, and all you...
Well, actually, but before you do, homework.
Yes.
Because what I want people to do for homework is go ahead, obviously, as per, you need to finish up all the stuff we've covered in the lesson and make sure that it functions properly within your level. The other thing I'd like people to do is to make a new prefab. Make what I'm calling a boss turret, and make it do something different. Either give it multiple barrels, because as you know, we've covered in code it should work with multiple barrels, but we've only used one barrel on the turret at a time. So you could give it multiple barrels. If you're feeling elite, you could give it some recoil or something, or you could get it to fire in bursts. But get into the idea of thinking about how to reuse and add on functionality to what you've already got. I mean, I'm not talking. I'm not expecting, explosions and anything else like that. Big particle effects or making the color, anything. But just look at, again, this is all about putting together, firing patterns would be good. In fact, one thing that I mentioned a while back, which you could do, a sort of fizz buzz idea for anyone who knows about that, you can use to create firing patterns and such like. Yeah, so go ahead and do that, and I would like it to be based on the turret, so that will give you some constraints. But I'm not just going to say, implement a turret with 4 guns on. Do if you have an interesting idea that you think you can do it. Any other news?
No, I think that's about it.
Cool.
Alrighty, so we'll see everybody later.
Bye.